Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're diving deep into allergies and anaphylaxis. Looks like you've been hitting the books, or I say the audio files, EMT training materials, huh?
Absolutely. Got all the good stuff here. Audio chapters, textbook excerpts. Looks like someone's prepping for something big.
And important too. Especially, wow, did you see this? It says here that anaphylaxis causes like 1,500 to 2,000 deaths every year in the U.S.
Yeah, those numbers really highlight the seriousness of these reactions, and the fact that so many of them happen at home. Well, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to things.
For sure. So before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up a bit. The basics. Our listeners send in some materials that define an allergic reaction as, get this, an exaggerated immune response. An exaggerated immune response. What does that even mean?
Well, basically, it means your immune system, the one that's supposed to be protecting you, or kind of jumps the gun. It mistakes something harmless, like, I don't know, pollen or peanuts, for something dangerous.
Okay, so like a false alarm.
Exactly. But instead of just a little blip on the radar, your body goes into full defense mode, releasing a flood of chemicals that trigger all those awful allergy symptoms.
So it's not the allergen itself that's the problem, but our own body's reaction to it.
Exactly. It's like your body's own security system going haywire. And the thing is, everyone's system is different, right? That's why you see such a wide range of reactions, even to the same allergen.
That's what's so wild. The materials our listeners sent in mention this idea of individual variability. And it totally makes sense. Like, my reaction to a bee sting is probably going to be totally different from yours, right?
Totally. And to make things even trickier, your own reaction can change over time. What causes a mild sniffle one time could trigger a life-threatening response the next. You just never know.
That's scary. And it makes you realize how important it is for EMTs especially to be able to quickly recognize and treat these reactions. Speaking of treatment, one thing that really stood out in the EMT training materials was the difference between, what were they? Local and systemic reactions.
Yeah.
It seems like that distinction is super important for an EMT to understand, right?
So absolutely. And it's actually pretty straightforward. Think of a local reaction like, say, a mosquito bite. Itchy, annoying, maybe a little swollen, but it's contained. No big deal, right?
Right.
But with systemic reactions, well, that's where things get serious. We're talking multiple body systems involved, hives, swelling in different parts of the body, trouble breathing.
And that's where anaphylaxis comes in.
Exactly. And that's where that quick recognition and treatment become absolutely crucial, because with anaphylaxis, things can spiral out of control really, really fast. It can be a matter of minutes.
Wow. So basically with systemic reactions, it's like the whole body's under attack.
Pretty much. And any one of those symptoms or a combination of them can be life-threatening if they aren't treated quickly and effectively.
So let's talk about those triggers then, the usual suspects. The materials mention 5 main culprits: foods, medications, plants, chemicals, and insect stings. Foods and medications seem pretty self-explanatory, but plants.
You'd be surprised. We're talking everything from pollen and grasses to certain trees and even weeds.
Like ragweed. Isn't that what causes hay fever?
Bingo. Hay fever is basically your immune system going to battle with harmless pollen. Now imagine that response, but times 10. That's the kind of danger we're talking about with systemic reactions.
You know what really freaked me out? That statistic about insect stings. How more people die from those than from snake bites?
Yeah, that one always gets people. And here's the thing. Almost half the time, those people had no idea they were allergic. They'd never had a bad reaction before.
So you could be walking around totally unaware that you have this life-threatening allergy, just waiting to be triggered.
And to make matters worse, honeybee stingers, they can get stuck,
Oh, right. I remember reading about that. So even if you get the bee off of you, the venom's still being pumped in.
Exactly. Up to 20 minutes, even after the bee is long gone. Crazy, right?
Like a ticking time bomb. So let's say you're an EMT arriving at a scene. Someone's having a reaction. What's going through your mind? What are those first priorities?
Well, the first thing is always scene safety, right? You can't help anyone if you become a patient yourself. But once the scene is secure, it's all about the ABCs. Airway, breathing, circulation.
Right, the basics. Makes sense.
It's the foundation of any emergency assessment. But with anaphylaxis, it's even more important because those ABCs can change so quickly.
Because like we were saying, those reactions can escalate so fast.
Yeah.
What are some of the telltale signs that someone's airway is compromised?
Well, one of the biggest red flags is stridor. Have you ever heard that sound?
Stridor. I don't think so.
It's like a high-pitched whistling sound when someone inhales. And let me tell you, it's not something you want to hear. Yeah, that stridor, it's not a good sign. That's your airway basically screaming for help.
And you've got to be able to recognize that sound right away and know what to do, no time to waste.
Exactly. This is where that EMT training really comes into play.
For sure.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, the training materials our listeners sent in, they really emphasize epinephrine.
Yeah.
Like it's the go-to treatment for anaphylaxis, the big gun.
Hmm.
But why is that? What makes it so effective?
It's actually pretty amazing what epinephrine does. It's like this super-powered hormone that mimics your body's natural fight-or-flight response. You know, that surge of adrenaline you feel when you're in a really intense situation?
Yeah, like when you think you're about to get hit by a car or something.
Exactly. That's epinephrine at work. And when it comes to anaphylaxis, that adrenaline rush is exactly what you need. It constricts blood vessels, which helps to raise blood pressure, relaxes airway muscles so you can breathe easier, and even blocks the release of those inflammatory chemicals that are causing all the trouble in the first place.
Wow, so it's like hitting the reset button on the whole allergic reaction.
Pretty much. And the best part is that it works fast, like crazy fast, which is obviously crucial in an emergency situation.
The EMT materials mention these pre-dosed auto-injectors, like the epi-pen. That seems to be the standard way to administer epinephrine. What's the advantage of using those?
Oh man, where do I even begin? Auto-injectors are a game changer for EMTs. First off, they're pre-filled with the correct dose, so you don't have to worry about measuring anything out in the heat of the moment. And trust me, when you're dealing with a life-threatening allergic reaction, every second counts.
Right, no time for hesitation.
And they're designed to be super easy to use. You literally just remove the safety cap, press it against the thigh, and boom, the device does the rest. You don't even need any special training or anything.
That's amazing. It seems almost foolproof. But are there any important steps or precautions that an EMT needs to keep in mind when using an auto-injector?
Of course. Even though they're designed to be simple to use, there are always a few things to remember. Always, always check the expiration date. Can't stress that enough. You don't want to be caught in a situation with an expired EpiPen. And make sure the medication itself isn't discolored or cloudy. If it is, don't use it.
Good to know.
Oh, and one more thing. Ideally, you want to inject into bare skin, but in a real emergency, you can administer it right through clothing if you have to.
Makes sense. Speed is key here.
Exactly.
Now, the materials also mention another type of auto-injector, the Alvi-Q. Is that basically the same thing as an EpiPen?
It's similar, yeah, but with a couple of cool added features. Like, for one, it's a lot smaller than the EpiPen, more discreet,
Right.
which can be a big deal for some people.
Right. Makes it easier to carry around.
Exactly. And it actually talks you through the injection process, which can be really helpful, especially if you're stressed out or, having a hard time thinking straight.
Wow, like a little robot medic. That's incredible.
Technology, right? They're always coming up with new ways to improve things.
So, okay, the auto-injector delivers the epinephrine, and then what? What happens next?
Well, even though epinephrine works quickly, you can't just assume everything is fine and dandy. You got to keep a close eye on the patient. Monitor their breathing, check their pulse, make sure their blood pressure is stable. Basically, you're looking for any signs that the reaction is getting worse or that the epinephrine isn't working as well as it should.
And if that happens,
Well, then you might need to administer a second dose of epinephrine or maybe try a different treatment altogether. Every situation is different, right? There's no one-size-fits-all approach to medicine.
that's true. It's all about being adaptable and thinking on your feet. The materials emphasize the importance of documentation, especially when it comes to administering medication. What's the reasoning behind that?
Documentation is key. It's not just about covering your butt legally, although that's definitely part of it. It's about making sure that everyone involved in the patient's care is on the same page. You need to document what medications were given, when they were given, how much was given, and how the patient responded. All of that information could be crucial down the line.
Especially if the patient needs to be transported to the hospital.
Oh, absolutely. For sure. The hospital staff needs to know exactly what's been done already so they can provide the best possible care. It's all about continuity of care.
Right, makes sense. Now, you mentioned earlier that some people, especially those with known allergies, might carry their own epinephrine autoinjectors or even those bronchodilator inhalers. Does that change anything for an EMT? What if the patient has already administered their own medication?
It definitely changes things. I mean, it's great that the patient was prepared and able to take those initial steps to manage their reaction, but it doesn't mean the EMT's job is done. In fact, it might even make things more complicated because now you've got to play catch-up.
Yeah, trying to piece together what happened and how much medication was taken.
Exactly. And you still need to assess the situation and make sure the patient's condition isn't deteriorating. Don't just assume that because they've taken their own meds that everything's fine. You got to trust your gut and your training.
Makes sense. So basically, even if the patient's already self-administered, the EMT still plays a critical role in assessing the situation and, like you said, making sure it doesn't take a turn for the worse.
Absolutely. You're still the medical professional on scene. You're the one who's been trained to recognize the signs and symptoms of a severe allergic reaction and to know what to do. So never downplay your role in that situation.
Now, we've been focusing a lot on epinephrine here, but the materials also mention other medications that might be used to treat anaphylaxis. What are some of those?
Well, for one, antihistamines, like diphenhydramine, which most people know as Benadryl, that one that makes you super sleepy. Antihistamines, they can be really effective at relieving those allergy symptoms like itching, hives, and swelling.
So it's not a primary treatment for anaphylaxis, but it can definitely help manage the symptoms.
Exactly. And then you've got corticosteroids, like prednisone. Ever heard of that one?
Yeah, I think so.
Corticosteroids are basically powerful anti-inflammatories. They help to reduce inflammation throughout the body, which can be really helpful in those more severe allergic reactions.
So it's like a multi-pronged approach. Epinephrine to stabilize the patient in the immediate term,
Yeah.
and then these other medications to kind of calm everything down and prevent the reaction from coming back full force.
You got it. And it's important to remember that every allergic reaction is different. What works for one person might not work for another. And even the same person can have different reactions at different times. That's why a thorough assessment is so important, and why it's so crucial for EMTs to be up to date on all the latest treatment guidelines.
We've been talking a lot about the immediate and often really dramatic symptoms of anaphylaxis. But your sources also mentioned that sometimes the signs can be delayed, especially with food allergies.
Yeah, delayed reactions can be tricky. It's like your body's playing a game of hide and seek.
And sometimes the symptoms don't show up for hours after exposure, so you might not even connect them to the actual allergen. That's got to be a real challenge for EMTs.
It can be. And it really emphasizes the importance of thorough questioning and careful observation. Like, sometimes it's not as obvious as someone going into anaphylactic shock. It might start with some mild stomach upset or maybe a few hives, but then escalate from there.
So it's not always black and white.
Exactly. And that's why those ABCs we talked about earlier are so crucial. If you're assessing a patient for a possible allergic reaction, you need to be paying close attention to their airway, their breathing, and their circulation, even if they don't seem that bad off at first.
Because things could change so quickly.
Exactly. And you want to be prepared for anything.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about prevention. What are some things people can do to be proactive about preventing severe allergic reactions in the first place?
Well, awareness is key, right? First and foremost, know your triggers. If you know you're allergic to peanuts, don't eat peanuts. Sounds simple, but you'd be surprised how many people end up having allergic reactions because they weren't careful enough.
Right. It's easy to get complacent.
And if you do have a known allergy, always, always, always carry your epinephrine auto-injector with you. And make sure those around you know how to use it, just in case.
Right. Because in those really serious situations, you might not be able to administer it yourself.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. If you're at a restaurant or eating food prepared by someone else, don't be shy about asking what's in it, how it was prepared. You have every right to know.
That's such great advice.
Yeah.
It's better to be safe than sorry. One thing that our listeners' sources only briefly mentioned, but that seems super important, is angioedema. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, angioedema. Yeah, it can be a tricky one, often gets overlooked, but it can be just as serious as some of those other symptoms we talked about.
So what is it exactly?
Well, you know how we were talking about hives earlier, how they're like a telltale sign of an allergic reaction?
Yeah.
Well, angioedema is kind of like hives' evil twin. It's a deeper swelling that happens beneath the skin. So instead of those itchy red welts on the surface, you have this swelling that you might not even be able to see.
So you might not even realize it's happening until it's too late.
That's the scary part. And it can happen anywhere on the body, but it's particularly dangerous when it affects the face, tongue, or throat.
Because those areas are all part of the airway, right?
Yeah.
So swelling there could be life-threatening.
Exactly. And because it's happening beneath the skin, it can be harder to detect. You might notice some swelling, but it might not seem like a big deal at first.
So what should people be on the lookout for?
Well, if someone's having an allergic reaction and their voice starts to change, or they complain of their tongue feeling swollen, or they have difficulty swallowing, those are all major red flags.
Those are all signs that the airway could be closing off.
Exactly. And that's when you need to act fast. Call 911, administer epinephrine if available, and monitor the patient's airway closely. You want to be super prepared for that situation because things can go downhill quickly.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. You've really highlighted just how complex allergies and anaphylaxis can be.
It's definitely not as simple as it seems, right? It's not just a few sniffles and a rash.
I could.
Talking about a potentially life-threatening condition that requires a quick and decisive response.
Absolutely. But even though it's complex, it's also fascinating.
Totally. And I think the more we understand about how these reactions work, the better equipped we are to treat them effectively. And hopefully, one day, even prevent them altogether.
It's amazing how much we've unpacked about just one condition. And thinking about our listener prepping for EMT training, they're going to be dealing with so many different medical situations.
It's true. But that's what makes it such a rewarding field, you know? You get to be there for people in their most vulnerable moments, and sometimes the knowledge and skills you bring to the table can truly make all the difference.
Absolutely. And in those high-pressure situations, having a solid understanding of the fundamentals is crucial.
Couldn't agree more. When you break it down, it's all about those ABCs. Airway, breathing, circulation. Master those, and you're well on your way to providing effective care in a whole range of emergencies.
So true. Well, we've covered a ton of ground today about allergies and anaphylaxis, from those basic mechanisms to some pretty intense life-saving interventions.
And we even touched on those more subtle things that often get overlooked, like those delayed reactions and the importance of patient education.
It's so important because at the end of the day, knowledge is power, right? For EMTs and for patients, too. The more we know, the better prepared we are to handle whatever comes our way.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of allergies and anaphylaxis. Big thanks to you, as always, for sharing your expertise with us.
Anytime. Always happy to geek out about all things medical.
And to you, the listener, thanks for joining us on this journey. Remember, keep asking questions, stay curious, and most importantly, never stop learning. We'll catch you in the next episode, ready to dive into a whole new world of fascinating information.